Welcome to the Reasons to Reason podcast. I'm your host and captain, Sal Galati. This is the show that's going to talk about all the things we're not supposed to: God, religion, and politics. So strap in, prepare to get offended, and maybe, just maybe, our nation can learn how to reason again. Thanks for joining us for another episode. I got my friend Rich Golz here. You might recognize him from a prior episode where we went through the resurrection evidence of Jesus, and he talked about kind of his faith. He's got some news to share on that front. But today's episode is going to be on a different little topic, the Fed. We're going to talk about a book he's read now called The Creature from Jekyll Island. This is not a book I told him to read, but he likes to kind of report on these books. And I've heard of this book, and it goes in detail about the Fed and the monster that this thing is. And, you know, there's a lot in the news about interest rates and whether the rates are supposed to go down and up, and Trump's yelling with Powell, and becoming pretty evident this institution that was always supposed to remain apolitical has become political. They should be lowering the rates by every measure of the economy and all indicators, but they're going against it, whereas the indicators were less showing that they should have done it before the election, but mysteriously before the election they lowered it. One could say to, you know, help the economy to make Kamala Harris's presidential run more likely. But anyway, I'm going to let Rich give you an update on kind of where he's at since our last conversation.
Thanks, Al. Great to be back. I really appreciate you having me. So since we last talked, things have continued to go really, really well. Our last podcast was about the book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. That was kind of when I was first starting to explore my faith. Since then, I've absolutely become a believer and started and continued reading the Bible and praying every day, and truly feel that God has answered my prayers. And pretty quickly was able to make some really, really big changes in my life, and very positive changes. I actually got baptized a few weeks back, which you got to see, which was awesome. I appreciate you being there. And it's really just been an incredible journey. I could not have pictured myself being here a year ago, you know, even 6 months ago, and have just become a much, much happier person. And I like to think better person, you know, still a lot of work to do, but it's been an amazing journey, and I certainly appreciate everything you've done, your mentorship in it. It's been a blessing to have met you.
Likewise, very much a pleasure to meet a young man like yourself, and always just holding true the promises of God that if you seek Him with all your heart, you'll find Him. And that's an encouragement to anyone out there who doesn't think they can find God. It's available. You just have to seek Him. So we're going to get to the topic here, and the Bible's very clear about the love of money, not putting money before God. Not that money is inherently evil, but loving it, trusting it, worshiping it, which unfortunately large segments of government and leadership, I believe, do, and has gotten us into the pickle that we're in as far as, an insane debt, obligations that we'll never be able to fulfill, theft from generations 2, 3, 4 generations from now. We've literally just crushed them under a debt. But I'm going to start with a clip from a miniseries called John Adams that was on HBO. I found it to be pretty true to history, but also there's a conversation here between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton where they're kind of discussing the precursor to what is we now know as the Fed.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
Then how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
You have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
Well, there you have it, as I have heard said. If men were angels, then no government would be necessary.
So that's a scene, and essentially what they're talking about is the situation we find ourselves in where we're enslaved by debt.
Yeah, so I found that very, very interesting, and it's very true to what we're experiencing today. You know, the little guy has very little say in what goes on in the government. It's really the banks backed by the Federal Reserve that the government gets all of its money from, and as a result, they're hostage to it. They're hostage to the owners of the Federal Reserve, which we'll kind of get into how it was founded a little bit later, but they're essentially the large banks in the United States. They were who founded and now own the Federal Reserve and, by extension, the federal government.
To that end, why don't you tell us about how the legislation that actually kicked off the federal bank as we know it got written and who was behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, where it might be interesting to start there is kind of what is the Federal Reserve and what does it say that it's there for? The Federal Reserve is a central bank, and a central bank is really a bank for banks. So banks have their money in the Federal Reserve and they get money from the Federal Reserve. It also is given the authority by the government to control our monetary policy, which essentially just means to print and issue our money and to set our interest rates. The Federal Reserve has, and says it has, what's called the dual mandate, which is to stabilize prices and to maximize employment. Those are their two stated goals, which, by the way, look since their founding in 1913. I don't think they've done a good job at that. And it was sold as sort of this, protective mechanism to prevent runs on banks and protect the little guy. But it was founded in a secret meeting, and this is where the title of the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, comes from. The creature is the Federal Reserve. Jekyll Island was a secret meeting in Georgia in 1910 between representatives of J.P. Morgan, the National City Bank of New York, which is now Citibank, the Rockefeller banking dynasty, Kuhn Loeb, which is a company that later on, through a partnership with Wells Fargo, would become American Express, and the representatives of the Rothschild banking dynasty. And I don't know about you, but I seriously doubt that those people were, altruistically just trying to form something to protect consumers. They would ultimately become the, founders passing the legislation of the Federal Reserve, and then through their banks, the Federal Reserve is owned by its member banks, would own the Federal Reserve and go on to profit from it.
So like helping the little guy. It's always the guys of the government when they pass something that's to help the little guy. Here's some observations. When inflation hit like really hard, it was out of control. Which businesses hurt more? The big business or the small business? I would say that the big business was more easily able to offset those increased costs on their product. So think McDonald's versus a mom and pop burger joint. The mom and pop burger joint had to go from charging $8 a burger to $12 a burger, where McDonald's could, spread it around a little bit more and absorb some of the costs to keep the clients flowing through the door. And then when it comes to borrowing, if the rates are staying artificially high like they maybe are now for political reasons, the small business are the ones that aren't going to borrow, and they're the ones who business is going to suffer, whereas big businesses can weather it, and also the big culprit that can weather it's the government. The government's not going to slow down their spending or borrowing because the interest rates are high.
Jefferson and Hamilton were kind of on opposite sides of the debate around forming a United States central bank, which I believe their debate was around the second United States central bank that existed. The Federal Reserve currently is the fourth, by the way. It's been tried 3 times before and failed every time. Jefferson was on the side of not having a central bank, and his quote was that a private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. And Hamilton, on the other side, who, if you look into his biography, had some personal connections to wealth, his defense in forming the Federal Reserve was, no society could succeed which did not unite the interest and credit of rich individuals with those of the state. A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. And essentially the same debate that we're having today.
Now, they left an aristocracy where a few people had all the power. And what Jefferson saw is if you set it up this way, it's going to go back to that, which is where we're at now. More billionaires than ever. And nothing against billionaires, nothing against millionaires. That's not the point. But the shift of wealth, and so quickly. And it's always been politicians that are come under the guise of helping the poor have exacerbated this split in wealth. Hamilton had a quote at the end of that, though, that conversation, which he's known for, if men were angels, no government would be necessary at all. But the problem is, though, the government should be there to avoid these problems. But as we look at it, everything they do exacerbates it. And then they come in with the solution that further exacerbates it. We had the example beforehand about the COVID bill that got passed right after Biden got elected. COVID had pretty much burned out by then. There was no need for another infusion of money into the system. Everyone knew that, at least the people that were making the policy, it's obvious that if you increase the money supply, inflation was going to come down the pipe. Yet they did it anyway. And then what did they pass after that? The Inflation Reduction Act, which was nothing to do with inflation, just a bunch of more spending on a bunch of nonsense.
And when the Federal Reserve prints more money or puts more money into circulation, as they did during COVID with that bill, it causes inflation. And everybody's familiar with what inflation is. Things are getting more and more expensive. And that's because there is just more money in circulation, and there's the same amount of goods and services that you can spend that money on. And that's obviously really a problem. People start to not be able to afford homes and other assets that inflate. But what's worse about that is that it really acts as a hidden tax, where, we're all familiar with, at the end of the year, you get a tax bill or you get a tax refund. In either case, a large portion of your salary is going to the federal government to spend on, what they spend their money on, and we can get into that as well. You're aware of that. You see that bill or you see a lower refund at the end of the year, and you probably don't like that, and I don't either. But the issue with inflation, and why it's known as the hidden tax, is because the Federal Reserve can essentially print money and give it to the federal government. They lend it, but at, just about zero interest, and so not much of an obligation to pay it back in any meaningful way when we can continue to rack up the debt. When they print that money and give it to the government can then spend it on whatever they want. Large social programs, wars, those are kind of two very large budget items of the federal government at the moment. And then what happens to you? Everything that you go to spend your money on is now more expensive. The impact is the exact same as if they were to just increase your taxes at the end of the year. But of course, if they tried to do that, people would not accept it. So they use this tool. They use the Federal Reserve printing money and giving it to the federal government to fund their spending that they know the American people would not approve if it were put to a vote to increase taxes.
Interestingly enough, in the first episode, I proposed an idea, a radical idea, that when the government would pass a bill where a lot of spending's involved, they would send a sample bill to every American on how much it will exactly cost them to do such and such, and then do the opinion poll. It's really easy for everyone to root for, let's do that, let's do this, let's spend it here, let's spend it there, when they don't see how it costs them anything. And this is exactly why the government does it the way you're describing. They know people will say no, but if they print the money, no one sees it, no harm, no foul. And if the inflation just keeps it tinkering at 2%, no one even notices, which they taught us is like completely acceptable. But when it ratchets it up, everyone wonders, how did that happen? The other thing you mentioned is the two areas that the money usually gets spent on, war and social programs. And those are two areas ripe with fraud. If anyone's got to be convinced that a lot of the money that went over to defend Ukraine actually was stolen and ripped off, and a lot of it sent back here to the politicians that were so eager to send the money there and don't get how this business works, well, we'll do another episode on that. And even the social programs. We did an episode on homelessness. I think we called it relational poverty. And the business that is the homeless business. They look at these people as dollars and cents. You get a government program to feed or whatever. Who gets the contract to feed them garbage for $25 a head? So it's a business, it's a scam, and it's all funded by this criminal's piggy bank that prints money out of thin air called the Fed. So let's talk about three things that are kind of hidden here. The inflation hurts the little guy. If you got assets, inflation's great. Your stocks go up, your real estate goes up, everything you own increases in value. It keeps up, if not improves or outpaces the inflation. The guy that gets slammed is the guy that doesn't own anything. Because one thing that doesn't keep up is his wage. His wage doesn't keep up with it. And most people know that. You could look at your personal experience. That's what happens. I have a personal story. Savings bonds. They used to give out, when you were a kid, 30-year bond. Guy would give you a $100 30-year bond that you would cash in. I actually been cashing some in because I'm 42 years old now. You don't need to be a math wizard to realize you got screwed. If you would have kept that money and invested it in almost anything, you would have done better than what you got from the government interest. So what they've done with inflation, they've actually stolen your money because the money they're paying you back with is worth less than when they made you the promise. So why don't you tell us about the history of money? Where does it come from? Why do we have paper money? Gold standard, how that all fits in?
This was one of the more eye-opening things, topics in the book that sort of opened my eyes to how this system works. And it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. You think about, what is money? It's just something that we can exchange with each other for goods and services, and we accept it because we know other people will accept it. That's it. It's just storing the value that before money existed, you would have to barter. So let's say, Sal, I need a house. You know how to build a house. I have a bunch of cows. You want cows, I want a house, great, we can make a deal. But what if you don't want cows? Well, now we kind of have a problem because I don't really have anything else. I'm a farmer. I don't really have anything else I can give you. So that's where money kind of changed to what's called commodity money. Commodities are just common good that, kind of have wide value, people use for a lot of different things. So one of the early ones was like grain, for example. You may not need my grain right now, but somebody else will. So it's kind of storing that value and allowing you to exchange it later. The most popular commodity that emerged was gold. There are some reasons for that, like, jewelry, it is valuable as an industrial metal. Those reasons aren't as important as just knowing that it is widely accepted and people do want it. Nobody had to tell people to accept gold. The government didn't have to come in and declare it was money. People just wanted it and agreed that this was a good thing that we all want and we can use it to trade with each other. But the problem there was that, you don't really want to carry a bunch of gold around with you when you're going to the market. And this, we're talking, hundreds, thousands of years ago. You can get robbed. It's very heavy. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the solution for that was that the people and businesses that mined and then refined gold into coins had a lot of gold and they needed somewhere to store it. So they had these really secure facilities and sometimes their own private armies guarding them. And they started to realize that there was a business there where, hey, we can store people's gold and charge them a fee. That's great. They don't have to carry it around anymore. So I take my gold to, Sal's gold storage, but I need to know that I'm going to be able to come back and get it later. So you would issue what's, a receipt for it. And this was called receipt money. And that receipt that entitled you to go to the gold storage and get the piece of gold is really the precursor to paper money because it became as good as gold, as the saying is. That paper receipt means you can go get the gold from the gold storage facility. So if I'm going to the market, I don't have to carry my gold anymore. I can just sign over that receipt for a portion of my gold to you, and you can go get the gold later. Or better yet, you can just sign that receipt over to somebody else later because, you don't really need to go exchange the gold. And the gold storage facilities and the people running it pretty quickly realized that, hey, nobody's ever really coming to collect their gold. And we have all these people always coming to us asking to borrow gold so that they can, buy things or do whatever they want with it. So why don't we start lending it out? Because, we know that nobody is going to come get it. And again, better yet, instead of giving the gold out to people who want the loan, why don't we just issue more receipts for it? And the second that happened, that was really important because the second that happened, money became created out of nothing. If I deposit 10 pounds of gold in Sal's gold facility, there's 10 pounds of gold sitting in the vault. I have a receipt for 10 pounds. Somebody else comes along, they want a loan for 10 pounds. The gold facility gives them a receipt for 10 pounds. Well, now there's 20 pounds worth of receipts floating out there, but there's only 10 pounds of gold. Think about that on a wider scale. They would lend and lend and lend like that until eventually enough people would come wanting their gold because there was a small percentage who would, need it for whatever reason, that they would start to not have enough gold to pay people out. And of course, the largest borrower often was the government or the ruler in place. They'd want to, fight wars or build a palace or whatever it is. They started to see that people were putting these gold places out of business, which meant their loans could not be taken out anymore. And more importantly, nobody wanted to accept those receipts anymore because they realized that there might not actually be gold backing. And that's sort of where we made the jump from those receipts, which was kind of known as fractional money, with, them not representing gold one-to-one. There were more receipts than gold. There was a fraction of gold backing those receipts, to fiat money, where the government had to step in and say, hey, you know what? You have to accept these receipts, often under penalty of death. And that's what we have today. The United States dollar is fiat money. Fiat just means by government decree. They're just saying that it's money. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That's not, hey, you can use it. That's you have to use it.
So a scam that I realized, and I feel like the Fed does something that if I did it, I'd be arrested, or if the mafia did it, they'd certainly be arrested. They could loan money that doesn't exist. They could print it out of thin air. But the thing that's real is the interest payment. That's cold hard cash. And you pay that. You pay that. You might not see it right away. Taxes stay the same or whatever you think it does. But like when things are taken away from you, when the roads aren't repaired, when things aren't getting fixed because there's so much money going to the interest is real hard cash. When you were talking about the kings starting wars and building palaces, it reminded me of this. This is from, you might not have gotten here yet, but this is 1 Samuel chapter 8. And this is before Israel had a king. And the beauty of it is God is meant to be Israel's king. And God doesn't put heavy burdens on the people. But the people are clamoring for a king. They want a human king just like everybody else. And here's what the Lord told Samuel to tell the people. Listen to this. This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equip for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best part of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to the officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. The founders read the Bible. They knew what a government does, and that a government must be restrained at all costs. Now, you give the government this bank that could lend money that comes out of thin air. We shouldn't be shocked at where we're sitting.
And they did foresee that problem in writing the Constitution, and maybe they weren't quite as strong and clear as they should be, but they, first of all, prohibited all of the states from issuing their own fiat currency, and they only awarded the power to Congress to establish the standard weights and measures of coinage, which is basically you can stamp gold coins and make sure they're a standardized weight, which is necessary because you need to know that if you're handing me a gold piece for something I'm selling to you, that it's actually 1 ounce or, whatever it is. So the idea that the Constitution gives Congress the power to not just create fiat money, but allow the formation of a privately owned entity to create that fiat money out of nothing is insane. And, I guess, it isn't specifically prohibited by the Constitution, but taking the Constitution alongside the Federalist Papers and any other documents at the time with them discussing these rules, it's very, very clear that that was not their intent, and they would be horrified to see that that's happening.
Yeah, we could do all this analysis and all that. Really, the question is, you ask, if the founders were alive today and they saw what we did, would they be happy or displeased? Even Hamilton would not have foresawn how far it got. So few people having so much of the wealth and power. This is what they tried to leave. A monarchy and a stocracy, and it's what we created here. So let's talk about kind of where we've gone as a country, where the goal of the country was to have a free people that could trade in the economy, their labor would be paid fairly and squarely. They wouldn't be exploited. They wouldn't be enslaved to debt unnecessarily. And you kind of tell us where we're at today.
Well, we are completely off the rails today as far as printing this money and inflating the currency. And I think what's really concerning about that is obviously, it's not just the fact that everything you're buying is getting more expensive. You have less money at the end of the day. It's the fact that inflation is actually transferring your money to the rich and powerful. And the reason that happens is because, as Sal kind of touched on, asset prices inflate. So if you own assets, which many people in this country do not, especially those at the lower end of the economic spectrum, you are just paying more for your stuff. If you own assets, you're becoming richer because those assets are now more valuable. So that's one way that the transfer of wealth is happening. The other way that it's happening is that when the government spends that money, let's say like supplemental nutritional assistance, for example, the government's inflating the currency, taking taking money out of your pocket there and through taxation, and you get and issues to low-income people these benefits cards to purchase food, which, by the way, I'm not making an argument against not being charitable or not helping the poor. I think that's all of our obligation and is obviously moral. The point that I'm making is that think about what they're spending those things on and what products are approved as part of that program. Well, it's products produced by big companies like General Mills and Monsanto and companies that we don't own. So it's not just taking money out of your pocket to fund these programs. The money is then being spent and given to the richest and the most powerful who own these companies and also own all of the assets that are becoming inflated.
This food is anything but nutritious. It makes the kids sick. It's Coca-Cola and potato chips. And then you have a whole other industry that benefits from this, like the healthcare industry, almost as if it's like coordinated. I was on the train going to work and I saw a sign, you may be eligible to get Amazon Prime for free. See how, blah, blah, blah. So here we go. Amazon, Mr. Wonderful, rented out a whole city to get married. He lobbied the government to pay for people to get a free Amazon Prime membership. How is he helping anyone? He's taking our money to fund his business. On top of it, aren't you discouraging people that are eligible for that from buying in their neighborhoods and supporting the local businesses? The hypocrisy is just mind-numbing. And it just goes back to, who is our God? If our leader's God was God and his will, we wouldn't even think about doing these things. But obviously the God of too many people in power is money itself.
Amen. And I think it's worth talking about just how much money we're spending. And when I say we, I mean the federal government, powered by the Federal Reserve, and how much debt we're in. So the U.S. government, the current budget is $6.75 trillion a year. It's hard to imagine how much money that is. We can't really comprehend how much money $1 trillion is. It's a huge number. And to kind of put it this way, which if you had a stack of $100 bills 40 inches high, you'd be a millionaire. If you had a stack of $100 bills amounting to $6.7 trillion, that stack would stretch from New York to Los Angeles and back. It's a staggering amount of money. And the government is only taking in about $5 trillion in taxes. So almost $2 trillion of that is the shortfall that they're borrowing from the Federal Reserve, which is just the Federal Reserve printing money and inflating your currency. The one thing we talked about earlier, I mentioned what they're spending money on, wars and social programs. What I didn't mention, 14% of the annual budget is just interest on the existing debt that the federal government is in. Just interest payments, not making payments to reduce the federal debt. It's making the minimum payment on the credit card 14% of our budget of that $6.75 trillion. And
that's money not going to roads, to schools, to hospitals, to infrastructure, to all the things we actually need, not the insane nonsense and the pet projects of insanity that have been passed. Now, a lot of times there's the debt and there's the deficit, and a lot of times all they're trying to get done now is even reducing the deficit, not even reducing the debt. So reducing the amount we go in the hole every year. No one's even we're not even wrapping our head around how to get rid of this debt. So we've been super negative, and it's not negative, it's being realistic and just trying to inform people because this is a democracy. We talked about the founding fathers in the beginning of the show, and I would say, was talking to Rich before the show, they did something amazing in the sense of every revolution you study, and I'm looking at the French Revolution right now and looking at how that ended up versus our revolution. Always the revolutions are kicked off by people that have nothing, fighting against the people with something. But our revolution was started off by men who had a lot to lose, and really their compass was morality and what was right and just. For just their personal well-being, a lot of them lost their treasure, a lot of them lost their homes, some of them were killed. And I think that's something to admire, but here we are. They bore this democracy. We have the freedom of speech. An idiot like me could have a microphone. I could bring Rich on. We could have this conversation, pour it into some people's minds that maybe haven't thought about it before. And little by little, you make change. So let's get to some solutions. One thing I heard someone say that was good, and I'm like, well, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. You mentioned it earlier. Inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. We've always been told, so if the inflation's up, the economy's hot, and we have to raise interest rates to slow it down. Raising interest rates to slow down the economy, you know what that means? People are going to lose their jobs. And there's math to it. People lose their jobs. People kill themselves. People get addicted to drugs, alcohol. Think of the families that are destroyed. These people don't care anything about it. To them, it's just a math equation. But why not, instead of doing that, why not encourage more goods to be manufactured, and that would lower the cost of the goods.
That is a great observation, and that's kind of that is the key here, and this has been proven to work. Countries in Asia, including Japan, used to see 15% growth a year for decades, and the reason being is that they still had a similar system where bank loans were creating money out of nothing. However, those bank loans were highly discouraged from going towards consumption and asset purchases, which do not do anything to add to growth. So, if I buy a house from somebody, that transaction is not doing anything to add to the productivity or growth of the country. It's a zero-sum transfer of something for money. Where there has been success is when you have banks focus on lending for productive reasons. So small business, for example, entrepreneurs starting their own business, developing new technology that actually improves people's lives. Manufacturing, areas that actually are creating something, not just transferring an asset like private equity or real estate. And the way that you do this is to basically get rid of the central planning and communism that is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is setting interest rates, which is just the price of money. We don't accept price controls in any other area in our country, but somehow we accept it there. As we know, or anyone who studied economics knows, individuals that are transacting business know so much more about their own situation, and their collective doing that is so much more effective than planning by a few people centrally. So what that system would look like is a return to smaller local banks that are encouraged to lend for productive reasons and set their own interest rates. All of the loan officers then would have a much better idea as to what they should charge for money based on the risk of what they're trying to underwrite. And if you made it more difficult to just lend for consumption and asset purchases, this reduces the price of those things, which helps people buy houses and everything else that they need, groceries and anything. And it also it spurs the economy by encouraging productive use of that capital. And the solutions that we do not need are things like price controls. And these things have been tried every time throughout history when currency has been inflated, and this has happened so many times in so many countries throughout history. I'm sure you remember history books showing people in post-war Germany where they have a wheelbarrow full of cash to go purchase bread. This is not new. This always happens when countries print money like this, and price controls never work, but we are starting to see those advocated more and more and more. To think that giving the people who are responsible for putting us in this situation more power over our lives is crazy. It doesn't make any sense.
It's a childish idea that I could force the food manufacturer to, like when eggs were going high. If you control the prices to fix the problem, there just won't be any eggs. You can't force the egg guy to make eggs and lose money. That's what these children don't understand. That comment you made about, the local banks, it makes a ton of sense. Like if two people came to me asking for me to loan them money, I could pretty much on my own, by asking some questions, figure out who's riskier, who do I want to charge more interest to, who do I not even want to lend to. And as far as the local banks, how much nicer would it be if the people loaning money, they knew each other? The bank knew the community, they were part of the community, there was a vested interest in it, in helping that loan to get out there so that the guy could start the business, to employ the community members. All that's been detached now with all this central planning. It reminds me of the savings and loan scene when there was a run on the bank, It's a Wonderful Life. And he's like, well, I don't have your money here. It's in her house, And then people started to understand what's going on, and then everyone kind of calmed down. But you can't have that in the system we've created here. It's truly become a worship of money. So as our Lord Jesus said, you cannot serve two masters because you'll love one and hate the other. And of that, he was talking between God and money. And it's evident to me that we have a society, a culture, a government that worships money and has put us in this predicament.
And if you really want to, kind of just start to explore what has happened and how bad of a situation we are in and why, I suggest starting at the website WTFhappenedin1971.com. The answer is that we suspended the gold standard, which was supposed to be temporary, by the way, and here we are 50 years later. But you'll see very clearly in dozens and dozens of economic charts how as soon as that occurred, everything went off the rails. Workers stopped sharing in the productivity growth in our country. Homes became unaffordable. Just a litany of social issues start to occur, all tied back to money. It is kind of the root of all evil in that sense.
Well, can you imagine a society where people didn't worship money, and how great that would be? Come, Lord Jesus. Hey, Rich, thanks for sharing what you learned from the book, and I hope you guys found that informational and beneficial, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sing it!
Thanks for joining us for another episode. I hope I got you thinking and out of your comfort zone. Believe me, the biggest fear your government has is a population that is thinking and talking to one another. So get out there, take a risk, start a conversation, make a friend, and reason with each other. Share the show with someone who you think needs to hear it. I wish you peace and love.